Job said God is evil. God is treating him badly. We know God doesn't do evil. Therefore, Job is wrong, not God. And therefore, Job is the one who's doing this upon himself. And again, he says he will not act in a way, in verses 10 through 15, God's not going to act in a way that perverts justice or brings evil upon a man who doesn't deserve it. Then verse 16 through 20, that's not the way God is. Verse 16 through 20, God is an impartial God. Verse 19, that God is one who shows no partiality to princes, nor regards the rich more than the poor, for they are all the work of his hands. In a moment they die. At midnight the people are shaken and pass away, and the mighty are taken away by no human hand. He said, God doesn't respect persons. God doesn't care about the rich or the poor, the walk. That God is a God over all. And to him, they are all the same. Notice the reference here in verse 19. They are all the work of his hands. You can't help but listen to Elihu's words and think back to Genesis 1 and 2. That Elihu knew the beginning, the creation of man. He knew that God was the source of creation. And he references that 2 or 3 times already. But again, he says God doesn't respect the person. But he says what God does do, verse 21 through verse 30, is that God looks at the way a man walks. And because he looks at a man's walks, nothing can be hidden from him. No matter how hard a man tries, no matter how hard a man, the lengths man goes to hide something from God, God knows it all. God's already seen it all. Notice verse 24. He shatters the mighty without investigation and sets others in their place. He breaks the mighty men, and he breaks them without warning, without looking, without having to go and say, okay, how did this person really act? God knows that. God doesn't have to search them. God knows. Verse 25, thus knowing their works, he overturns them in the night, and they are crushed. God is God is impartial. Verses 21 through 30, God is omniscient. God knows all things. And then finally, verses 31 through verse 37, Elihu says, Job has added to his sin here. Verse 35, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like a wicked man. For he adds rebellion to his sins. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. Elihu says, I wish that Job could have a trial before God. I wish that God would come and speak to Job. Oh, there's irony there. There's irony in the whole story. He says, I wish Job would stand before God and God would prove him wrong. He said, because Job has spoken so boldly, so richly of himself, he has such a high opinion. I wish God would put him in his place. And he says that Job answers like a wicked man. And not only that, verse 37, he adds rebellion. He is rebelling against God. He is refusing to listen to God. From there we go to chapter 35. And Elihu begins to explain God's silence. Elihu begins the first 8 verses to say Job's words are presumptuous. Elihu says that Job thinks himself more important than he really is. He says, Job, you're not important. God's not going to stop and come to you. Why do you think God's going to do that? You're just a regular man, and you're a wicked man. God's not going to come to you. Then you look down at verses 9 through verse 16. He says God does not answer because of man's pride. He says that God won't answer Job because God has no reason to. Job, the only reason you want God to speak is because you're a prideful man. That you want to be acknowledged by God. He says, therefore, God will not acknowledge you, because that's just not the way God works. He goes from there to chapter 36 and 37. The end of Elihu speaking. And in the end of his speaking, he speaks on God's behalf. Now, up till this point, Elihu has been pretty civil in what he says. But beginning in verse 30, in chapter 36, Elihu begins to speak a little bit out of his range. Notice verse 2. Bear with me a little, and I will show you. For I have yet something to say on God's behalf. Elihu says, I'm going to tell you what God's got to say. Now, wait a minute, Elihu. What makes you think you can say what God's going to say any more than these other men said? The answer is he can't. But as we like to say, he's gotten a little big for his britches here. He's our say, I'm going to tell you what God wants you to know. Now, one thing real quickly is in these passages, Elihu has, and we didn't point these out, 2 or 3 times Elihu has stopped and said, Job, if you want to answer, answer. And there's been a pause. Typically in the chapters, there's been a pause because what has Elihu seen? He saw the friends give their response, Job give his. Elihu gave Job a place to respond, but Job is not going to respond to Elihu. I'll tell you what, I hate to push us past our time, to try to rush this next part, because I want us to dig into what Elihu says here. So we're going to stop right here tonight. I was hoping we get through Elihu's speeches. We got close. Next week, if you want to go ahead and read ahead, read chapter 36, 37, and then you can start reading from 38 to the end of the book. We're not going to get that far next week, so we're going to really dive into what God says. But here's what I want you to look for. I want to give you a challenge next week to do this. Between now and next week, read chapters, at least chapter 36, 37, and 38, and look at the storm. Because Elihu is going to begin to introduce an element to describe God. And what's interesting is he's going to use an element, he's going to describe God in a way that's going to pop up in chapter 38. I got to be careful not to go ahead and tell you what the answer is, but read chapter 36, 37. Look how Elihu argues from God. Look at 38, what happens in chapter 38, and then think back to what Elihu says and see if you can see the connection. Some have said Elihu sees something coming in the distance, and he uses that for his argument. And it's very interesting. Elihu begins to include these elements for what God's about to say in chapter 38. But for tonight, I appreciate everyone's attention. Any question or comment about chapter 32 to 35? I know we covered it fairly quickly, but basically Elihu is just rehashing the arguments that's been given so far up to this point. Again, appreciate everybody's attention, everyone being here. We're going to stop right there in chapter 36. Next week, we'll pick up here in chapter 36, and we'll see 36, 37, 38, and following. That's all we have for tonight. I appreciate everyone's attention, and you're dismissed.